Good. I'm just a big teddy bear. So, all right. Well, just whenever you're ready, Tori, we'll take your cue.
Okay. All right. So in 1994, humanity saw one of the largest scales of mass killings ever to occur. This was the Rwandan Genocide. Afterwards, the UN promised to never let something like this happen again, but it has, in the exact same continent, just 18 years later. This was the South Sudanese Genocide, which began in 2013. In this genocide, 50,000 people have died, 2.3 million people were displaced out of their home country, 70% of schools have closed, 6 million are hungry, and rape of women and children has become the norm. This story begins with Egyptian and British colonization of the country of Sudan, but it gave Sudan independence in 1956. After that, South Sudan wanted independence from Sudan, and in 2011, they gained it. In Sudan and South Sudan's fight for independence from other countries, they were all united. But after they were no longer united, those tribal fights came to light. So once they were no longer united, with the president Salva Kiir, who was a Dinka, one of the majority ethnicities of South Sudan, chose Machar, a Nuer, who was another one of the major ethnicities of South Sudan, to be his vice president. Though most of the population was represented with the major ethnicities in power, the ethnic fight for power between Salva Kiir and Machar came to light. Afterwards, their respective ethnicities started a civil war, and within the first week, 1,000 people died. Then in the first week as well, 100,000 people were displaced out of their country. Everyone was veering for resources and weapons that were flowing into the country, and the UN officially declared intervention, but there was none. The US imposed an arms embargo, meaning they didn't want any weapons coming into South Sudan. However, there are other countries in the UN that would most likely block that sanction, because there are countries such as Russia and China, who are a part of the UN, who benefited from the allies that are neighboring countries to South Sudan who gained from the genocide. Additionally, during this time, South Sudan was facing a man-made famine. This is also referred to as hunger warfare, and 100,000 were starving, and 5.5 million are at risk for starvation still. The UN declared famine in South Sudanese state called Unity, and Machar's rebels blocked any sort of foreign aid. As they were trying to ethnically cleanse the nation, they were doing this by starvation as well as other means such as brute force. And the ICC was created years ago based upon the Rwandan Genocide so that this wouldn't happen again. And this is the International Criminal Court. However, just 18 years later, the ICC, the US, and the UN all did nothing to help South Sudan when thousands were dying. This story is just one example of many examples when international crises go ignored. Hi, my name is Tori Ballard, and I'll be talking about why the US must be a global nation. So first, a few definitions. First, isolation is when a country does not interact in another nation's affairs and is just completely to itself. Intervention is the complete opposite, where a nation does act in another country's affairs. And thirdly, globalization is when all the countries in the world are interconnected and work together as one ecosystem. And then finally, power projection is the ability of a nation to deploy and sustain troops out of its own borders. Next, there are a few limitations. The point of this thesis isn't to come up with a solution for the problem, just to discuss these problems, so there's not going to be any solvency involved. Secondly, we're only going to discuss US intervention and not the intervention of any other countries. And thirdly, funding for foreign aid and intervention will not be discussed because the effectiveness and the amount of aid is just another thesis in and of itself. So there's quite a bit of history on the background of this subject, and it begins with the founding fathers and then just goes through the history of America with the 19th century and then the world wars as well. So first, with the founding fathers such as Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, a lot of them considered themselves to be libertarians, meaning that they believe you should just involve yourself in your own affairs and not interact with other countries as much. And at the time of the founding fathers, the US was a very different nation than it is today. So of course it had different standards, especially considering most other nations didn't really recognize the US as a nation, such as Britain and France. So the US really didn't have any place of intervention at that time. So moving forward to the 19th century, as you can see in this cartoon depicted here, it's satirizing Teddy Roosevelt's intervention in Latin America. Although he said he was isolationist, he actually intervened quite a bit in South America, and he had the carry a big stick but speak softly diplomacy policy, meaning that you should be kind and treat others with respect, but if it comes down to it, you need to be able to defend yourself. And also at this time, the Monroe Doctrine came about, saying that only the Western Hemisphere could concern itself with South America. So then there wasn't much going on until World War I and World War II, when the US was begged by the Allies to come and join in the war and intervene, and it greatly changed the trajectory of the world wars. So moving forward to more modern times, such as the Cold War, the Korean War, Vietnam, and even most recently a lot in the Middle East, particularly Afghanistan, we can see that US intervention really just depends upon who's in the White House or who's in Congress at the time, and US foreign policy really goes from diplomacy to boots on the ground. So looking at the history of US intervention, we can see that US intervention is important because it impacts democracy, liberty, and freedom of the US and the world at large. And this is for three reasons. First, economically. Second, for military strategy. And thirdly, for a human rights perspective. So first, economically. Intervention benefits US economics and the world economics, whereas isolation prohibits growth. So the US has a lot of its power coming from its strong economy, considering that according to Silver, the US is a quarter of the world's GDP, and the world depends upon the US in a lot of ways. And in fact, the US also has an opportunity to aid growing nations, such as that in Africa and Central America. And according to the authors of Why Nations Fail, this is for a few reasons that have built up America itself, and that's for promoting ingenuity, saving investment in free markets. So if the US doesn't help these nations, they can fall further behind, and the growth of their economies will in turn help the US as well. So we can see this with two examples, those being Venezuela and South Korea. So first, Venezuela. The US and Venezuela were allies for a long time, and Venezuela was one of the richest countries in South America for a long time. That was until the Bolivarian Revolution in 1999. This was essentially the socialist takeover of the country, and the US didn't really have much of an action other than imposing economic sanctions, which didn't help the common people, but really just angered the leaders of Venezuela. So the US was pretty apathetic and didn't aid Venezuela in any real way. And we can see this today because in 2017, Lowry found that 3/4 of the population have lost significant weight from the socialist regime. Next, the comparison between North and South Korea. So though it just seems like it might be an abstract border between these two nations, it couldn't be further from the truth. So with South Korea, its success goes back to history of the Korean War. According to Hickman, when the US had a foreign policy of containment, meaning it wanted to keep the world, or most of it, capitalist and keep communism to the USSR, but USSR propaganda was gaining traction, especially in Asia. And that's when the US came in and affected South Korea, but however, you can see that it failed with North Korea. Today, South Korea has a booming economy. It's a place of innovation, technology, and business, whereas South Korea is a place of authoritarianism and the people are in abject poverty. South Korea has the 12th largest economy in the whole world, and it's still growing. And according to Forbes, in 2004, the GDP surpassed $1 trillion. So some refutations to how intervention benefits economics is mostly that we need to put America first. As Americans, we need to focus on the growth and protection of America and not really concern ourselves with other nations because they can handle it themselves. Moreover, saying that we need to intervene is American exceptionalism, and at best, it's just simply arrogant. Sometimes these countries don't even want or need our aid, and it's putting our soldiers and our economy at risk when oftentimes it creates what's called a power vacuum, which is when you take out one bad force or one bad leader, but it just takes away the structure that that country once had, and it just leaves an opportunity for another bad leader or another bad regime to come in. So in response to those refutations, I would say it's a nice theory to think that all nations are independent, however, they're just simply not. And it's a logical fallacy to say that you must put America first, but you can't take care of other nations at the same time, because it's simply just not a dichotomy. And both are very feasible to do, and you can do both at the same time. It's not one or the other. And also, it really does impact the future, because though a lot of people may think that the immediate effects of intervention will not help in the long run, they really do, because it affects the people who live in much poorer countries and it gives them a chance. So the second reason for US intervention is military strategy. So US intervention helps benefit future and current wars, data collection, the protection of citizens, and gives the US the militaristic edge. And in order for the US to have the militaristic edge, we need to be interconnected with other countries, both through land and technology. And just about the US military, it's inarguably one of the most powerful in the history and still currently in the world, and it's one of the largest as well. The US has 800 bases worldwide, whereas if you compare that to the world's foreign bases, if you add all of the entire world's foreign bases, you get 30. So the US military influence was especially encouraged in Cold War, and now it's used a lot for just intel collection. And the maintenance of the US military in our defense budget costs approximately 70 to 100 billion annually, according to Vox. And you can see that in this graph here with the defense budget, and compare that to the GDP, it's only a fraction, where the GDP is at 20.4 trillion. So even according to Democrat leaders like Hillary Clinton, as she was quoted saying, US military leadership stability for the globe is a fixture for foreign policy. So we can see that by her saying this, it's not a party issue, and that both parties agree on this. So two ways we can see this in action is through the correlation of base location and allies, and also the ability for power projection of the US. So first, for base location, we can see with an example of Ramstein Base in Germany, and also where we're just located in the Middle East, because we're allied with Israel and we have bases there. So additionally, with bases in Europe, particularly Germany, it's located there for a very particular reason, in that collecting intel from Iran through radio system waves. And through this, we're able to do that because Germany is located between Iran and the US. So when radio systems bounce from Germany to Iran, back to Germany, then to the US, that allows for less hacking and interference, which simply wouldn't be possible if it was just from the US to Iran. And Ramstein is also an example of how this aids with power projection. Because with power projection, as previously stated, it helps to have us have troops deployed and be able to sustain those abroad, which further aids in a faster, more efficient, and cost-effective way of reacting to any information that's gathered, according to Wendover. And this really helps with preemptive action so that it's not leading to prolonged wars and more money lost and soldiers' lives lost. So in refutation, some would say that it's not the US's responsibility to defend other countries, and to say that we need bases abroad is simply, again, exceptionalism and moreover imperialism, according to Tyrell. And the US is not the world's cop, and to say that we are infringes upon the sovereignty of other nations. And these countries are not weak, it's just that Americans are arrogant to say that we need to act in their wars or to have a leading stance in the world. So in response to those refutations, I would say that these countries actually are vulnerable with examples like Japan and South Korea, because they're located by China, which is a global threat right now. And the US offers a nuclear umbrella to these nations, which basically protects neutrals and allied nations. Because the US does have nuclear technology, as do other more malevolent countries such as Russia and China. And if Japan and South Korea had to make their own weapons, and if the US refused to aid them, then this would just turn into a risk for the US because these countries could turn on the US as well. And additionally, though it may not be politically correct, the US is simply in a unique position for this, and it's an obligation for the US to help protect other nations. And to say that they need to defend themselves is naive at best, but apathetic at worst. So the third reason for US intervention is for a human rights stance. So American intervention keeps human rights intact, whereas other countries have lower standards for human rights, such as an example of crimes against women and child rights. So the US cannot be silent if infringement upon human rights occurs. And though it may seem insignificant to privileged Americans, it's not irrelevant, and it's very important for these countries. And two examples of when this has occurred is with the Rwandan Genocide and the Holocaust of World War II. So in the Rwandan Genocide, if the US, or really anyone, had intervened and acted, 800,000 lives could have been saved and culture could have been preserved. Instead, everybody ignored the situation. Thousands died for no other reason than simple tribalism. And in this case, the Hutus, one of the ethnicities of Rwanda, slaughtered Tutsis and Tutsi sympathizers, according to Rosenberg. So the story begins with German colonization in 1894, where the Tutsis were more European in appearance because they had lighter skin and they were just taller. So in the eyes of the Germans, they were superior to the Hutus because the Hutus were more African looking because they were shorter and darker. And because of this, the Germans gave the Tutsis most of the positions of power, although they were only 10% of the population. So moving on later in history, the Belgians eventually took over, and the Belgians gave the Hutus and the Tutsis race identity cards, so they could be easily identified which race they were and discriminated against based upon that. So Rwanda eventually wanted independence from Belgium. And because most of the people who were fighting for independence were Hutus, because they were most of the population, according to Rosenberg, Belgium gave them more power, more positions of power in their peace treaty. So this really made the Tutsis indignant because they believed that they were superior, and the Hutus then unleashed their vengeance upon the Tutsis, creating really harsh legislation and in turn discriminating against them. This all came to a head on April 6, 1994, where an airstrike killed the president of Rwanda because Hutu extremists were upset about him creating more Tutsi liberal legislation and giving them more rights. This is when the 100 Days of Slaughter began, and Tutsi card carriers were then, if they were caught, they were slaughtered with machetes, clubs, and other brutal weapons. And in fact, some even paid to be killed with a bullet because it was less painful than being killed with a machete. Of course, women and children were raped and mutilated before their deaths. And at the time, 10 Belgian peacekeepers came into the country to see what was going on. However, they were killed during that time. So Belgium pulled its troops out and nobody acted during this time. Rwanda was isolated at this point and was not helped. And that's when 800,000 people died mercilessly. So the second example of when there's isolation is with World War II, and specifically what happened in the Holocaust. Luckily, eventually the US stepped in World War II, and most agree that that's a good thing and that the US should have. In fact, it seemed inevitable that the US would eventually step in because the Allies were begging the US to come into the war. But however, at the time, the US wanted to be neutral in the 1920s and 30s. That was its foreign aid policy. In fact, the US didn't want to join NATO, and believe it or not, the US actually tried to decrease its military size. In September 1939, when Americans were polled, 93% of Americans said that they did not want to join the war. This was, of course, until Pearl Harbor. So once Pearl Harbor occurred and America joined, the trajectory of World War II was stopped, where it was leading to even more lives lost and an authoritarian regime over the whole world. Some say that the US should have acted even further before because lots of people were killed for no good reason. So in Refutation for a Human Rights Stance, people say that other nations can have their own sense of morality, and they have their own traditions and their own culture. It's just a difference. And the US has no moral high ground in order to dictate what other countries can do. And in fact, this can really come down to identity politics and discrimination, because if you look at intervention in the past, it's mostly to do with Europe, which most Americans identify with, and not so much in Africa. In response to these refutations, I would say that's exactly the goal, not to discriminate who we intervene in. And also the goal is not imperialism to spread American ideals. It's just to spread peace, democracy, and liberty, which a lot of people unfortunately don't have. And cruelty is not a part of culture. Child brides should not be a part of any culture because that's just simply cruel, and that's not right. So the US should not stand behind abuse just because it's what's normal in other countries and because it's politically incorrect to say that it's wrong. So in review of points, the US should be an interventionist country because for the sake of economics, military strategy, and for the sake of human rights. To summarize, Krenger, US Texas representative, said, "Foreign aid must be viewed as an investment and not an expense." Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Any questions?
Yes.
Okay.
First of all, good job. That's a big boy topic. I appreciated the way you kind of reined it in and limited it, so kind of able to maintain focus. You had good tight structure, I thought. This is my observation is, and you made this point several times, subtly, this is a delicate balancing act. You know, when do you interfere? When do you not interfere? And for people to, or for governments and for the U.S. to view this as an absolute, I think is disastrous. Do you think that, do you think the current political climate is one that lends itself to an absolute view of this intervention policy, or is it, are we still kind of taking the position of we're going to pick and choose where we intervene?
Well, I actually think right now a lot of people believe black and white, and I don't think people would really see it as for just a human rights stance. It's really, are you on one side or the other? And like, especially if it happened now with the president we have, if you like him, you're for it, and if you don't like him, you're against it, regardless of any other reason.
Well, good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I can't figure out where you are on my screen here, but I don't know how to get you back on here. Well, can you see me?
Yes, ma'am, I can see you.
Okay, well, I'll just pretend like I'm in class. So my question was for you at the very beginning, or maybe towards the beginning, you had a comparison of 800 American bases around the world, military bases, and the rest of the world combined is only 30. So what would you say to someone who said that we as a country have an obligation to our own citizens to at least be a percentage based of how much money we spend foreign bases? So what do you think about that? Just as a thought process, what do you think about the closing of foreign bases, regardless of whether they're our allies?
Okay. Well, I can understand why someone would think that it needs to be based upon a percentage of the population or something. But as I said before, it's really essential to the world, and especially American security, that we have a lot of foreign bases. And particularly with the nuclear umbrella, again, too, there's a lot of other countries like Russia, China, etc. There are a lot more that are planning, if they could, if there wasn't probably U.S. intervention, they would try to take South Korea and Japan and other countries like that. Hi, Matt.
So you think it's worthwhile to continue with them, regardless of the budget?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Because it's only a small percentage of the budget, as you could see in comparison, and I think that's one of the priorities of our budget, just basic security and protection. I think that should be one of the priorities.
Okay.
Anything else?
I have one comment. In your third point, when you got to your refutation response, I thought you did a really nice flip on the refutation argument and turned that for you. So that's whether or not you realize it, I'm sure you did. You're usually cognizant of that kind of thing. You did a good job of using the opponent's argument for your benefit. So I thought you did a nice flip on that.
Thank you.
Hey, Tori, good job. I really appreciate you taking this on. This is a very controversial topic that you broached here. And I think if you look at history as you did, the U.S. has blown it intervening, and we have been helpful when we have intervened. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis. My question is, where do you think we are right now? Do you think we're doing a fairly good job? Do you think the Trump administration has done a good job intervening or not intervening? Or where do you think we are as a country right now?
Well, I think one of the main things that he did to persuade a lot of voters was say we need to put America first. I think he has done that, but he has also done some things for nations like pulling out of the Middle East a lot. And in that situation, I think it was a really good thing because sometimes intervention is just not necessary after a point because it was something like 17 years. Mm-hmm. And at this point, we weren't helping anyone. So if it's not helping, then there's no point in it. So I think that he has put America first a lot. And in a way, that's good. But I think his foreign policy strategy is really interesting because though he said he's putting America first, he hasn't always stayed out of other countries. So he's kind of gone against his own word in that way sometimes.
He kind of does what he wants to do, doesn't he?
He does.
Thank you, Tori. You did a great job. I'm proud of you.
Thank you.
I'm going to make an assumption here, so correct me if I'm wrong. You had to take this thing and you had to really telescope it down because this is a huge topic. Mm-hmm. So my guess is that you have a wealth of information that you just didn't even get to simply because kind of that scope creep thing. Mm-hmm. I don't think you would ever end this type of argument. So in that respect, what was your most difficult challenge when trying to get your arms around this?
Trying to limit all the examples we're looking at. So, sorry, my cats are going crazy back up there. A lot of this was there were so many examples, like reading about Syria and deciding what to limit it to and which examples to choose. Trying to choose bigger examples, like of when the U.S. did intervene versus when it didn't. Because, like, the example of the Rwandan Genocide versus World War II, and also other things like it can be if there's an actual war or if it's an economic situation.
Okay, good. Well, Tori, I don't have anything else. Anybody else have any questions? No. This is a really good way for you to end this senior year because that was a really, really solid presentation.
Thank you.
I commend you. I know you've worked hard, and not everybody has the opportunity to read your paper. I thought your paper was excellent, very fluid, very, very well written, and you articulated yourself very well in this presentation. So congratulations to you. This is a done deal. You can put a bow on it now.
I know. We're done.
Congrats, Tori. All right. Well, listen, I'll let everybody go, and we'll catch you guys after lunch. Good job.
Okay. Bye.